Welcome to Paradigms at paradigms.life, the radio show and podcast that brings you inspiring people with visions of a viable future for life on Earth that includes humans. Hi, I'm Baruch, host of Paradigms. Glad to be here with you. Thanks for tuning in. We have a very interesting show. Two doctors, researchers, are going to talk with me about ME/CFS, that's Myalgic Encephalomyelitis, and chronic fatigue syndrome, and similarities with long-haul COVID and treatment ramifications. It's a bit scientific. They've done a great job of breaking it down for us, but take your time with this one. You might need to listen to it twice. This is important stuff, so let's get right to it on this episode of Paradigms. Doctors Ken Friedman and David Maughan, welcome to Paradigms.
Thank you.
And David, welcome back. I'm really glad to see you.
Yeah, well, I'm delighted to be back too.
Now, you two both have a very interesting experience as researchers dealing with chronic fatigue syndrome and myalgic encephalomyelitis. And I'd love to hear about your experience with that and what that is bringing you to notice and think and learn in your work and as a person in relation to long COVID. So let's start out. Ken, tell me a little bit about yourself.
I am currently an associate professor at the School of Osteopathic Medicine in Stratford, New Jersey, Rowan University. But more importantly, I am the father of now an adult child who has ME/CFS, and she became ill with ME/CFS in the mid-1990s. At that time, ME/CFS was not as well known as it currently is. And when she became ill, she was in college and we brought her home, and I had to identify what her illness was because there wasn't a physician who knew what she had or was willing to treat her. And that was despite the fact that I took her to every medically relevant physician in the New Jersey Medical School where I was teaching at the time. And they all just threw up their hands and said, I don't know what she has, but I can't help you. And so that started me on a quest to not only identify what she had, but also to be able to provide her with help. And it became obvious that she was not the only one that had such an illness. The current estimate is that there are up to 3.5 million people in the United States with ME/CFS. And if you now include patients who have what is termed long-haul COVID, there are going to be many, many more patients with a very similar illness. And so that's how I got started into this business. And what I have done, to briefly summarize what I have done in the field of ME/CFS, I have participated in the writing of 3 diagnosis and treatment manuals for ME/CFS. I have been a guest editor or co-guest editor of 3 medical journal issues devoted to ME/CFS. Some of those are now becoming books. And I served on the first Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Advisory Committee, which is or was a committee that provided information and advice to the U.S. Secretary of Health on how to deal with ME/CFS. So, David, I give it over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I am a research professor at the University of Vermont, had been working as a molecular physiologist for 45 years, investigating muscle diseases, published a number of papers on cardiomyopathies. But the research I've undergone in the past decade has been focused on chronic fatigue syndrome or myalgic encephalomyelitis. My wife has had chronic fatigue syndrome for over 2 decades. It was triggered by mononucleosis in 2000 when she was Dean of Admissions at the University of Vermont Medical School. She had to take disability retirement 6 years after that, suffering from severe fatigue, dysautonomia, that is, a very mixed up nervous system, brain fog, and other symptoms that are classic to myalgic encephalomyelitis. As Ken will go into more detail, ME/CFS, which is the abbreviation for myalgic encephalomyelitis, and chronic fatigue syndrome, is a metabolic, neurological, and autoimmune illness, and that it has a very large, a genetic predisposition to this illness, which has been studied recently in some detail. The long COVID, which is now enveloping our country and the world, is similar to ME/CFS. In fact, Ken has published in this area just very recently, to demonstrate the similarities between that. And I'm hoping that he'll go into more detail about this too. Let me just conclude my little bit by saying that the impact of this illness has been profound for Kathleen's life and mine as well. And, as Candace has relayed to you, it's also been profound in his life as well, has directed his research and the concern for his daughter to have a normal life. And it's been my case too, where Kathleen has had to transition, and I have to a completely different lifestyle than we had expected some years ago. Our situation, my situation, Ken's situation, his daughter and my wife's situation is very similar, I would say, when you can, to nearly 2.5 million Americans who have this illness, ME/CFS, which 25% are reputed to be bedridden, 50% housebound, and the other 25% unable to work nearly to the same extent that they did before. In fact, it's been proposed that it be actually long COVID, a subset of ME/CFS. And if that's the case, the number of patients will increase many, many fold, from 2.5 million Americans to a larger set. And if this is the case, then America will really experience a medical, social, and economic crisis of unprecedented proportions, not only in this country, but really in the world.
You're listening to my conversation with Doctors Ken Friedman and David Maughan, talking about myalgic encephalomyelitis and chronic fatigue syndrome and long-haul COVID. We're going to get into some more of the science of this, but first we need a little music. I do. Here's Roddy Elias, What You Needed. This is Paradigms at paradigms.life.
I've never been so tired or felt so all alone. Your face behind the curtain, a hand that I can't hold, and what is there to say when words are frail and hollow, when what you need the most is one thing I can give, to feel your breath across my face and wipe the worry from your brow. Sometimes we try behind a mask, with all that's human sealed away. Sometimes we're trapped in our own skin, with all that's human sealed within. And better days are coming, a lightness in the air, There's hope on the horizon. If I could just get there, if more lives could be saved, I treat a heart that's hollow and measure every breath as though it were my own. I'd summon out the summer wind and wipe the worry from your brow.
That's Roddy Elias from his album, Not This Room. That's What You Needed. And now let's get back to my conversation with Doctors Maughan and Friedman, talking about our immune systems and long COVID. Ken, you have proposed a new category, a new acronym, PAPIS, which stands for Post-Active Phase of Infection Syndromes, as an umbrella term for things like ME/CFS, long haul COVID, and who knows what else may be headed down the pike towards us. Ken, could you talk a bit about PAPIS and what that means and why that's an important term for people to understand?
PAPIS began as an idea that actually came out of the description of long haul COVID. The overlap of symptoms between long haul COVID and ME/CFS is so profound that it seemed that they were almost identical. They are not identical, but they are almost identical based upon the overlap of symptoms. And prior to this profound overlap between these two distinctly different diseases, there has been a history of at least 40 years of researchers trying to identify a unique virus that was the cause or is the cause of ME/CFS. And because of this overlap, the profound overlap between these two obviously different diseases, it became apparent to me that it is futile to look for a unique virus that causes such an overlap, because multiple viruses or multiple infections or multiple triggers seem to be able to cause this constellation of symptoms in common. And so I wrote a draft of a paper and came up with the acronym Post-Active Phase of Infection Syndromes. And I decided that I would attempt to put it in one of the medical journals which I was editing. And I asked my other co-editors to read it, and if they could agree or if we could come to some agreement as to the content of that paper and as to the content of what the acronym Post-Active Phase of Infectious Syndromes means, that we would publish it jointly together. Because if I in the United States, one of the other editors who is in the UK, and two other editors in different countries in Europe came to an agreement that they felt that this term PAPIS embraced not only ME/CFS, but long haul COVID and some other diseases like chronic Lyme disease. And chronic Lyme disease is of significance because chronic Lyme disease is precipitated not by a virus, but by bacteria, one or more bacteria. Then it lends more importance to the term PAPIS because it's not only viral. These kinds of illnesses with overlapping symptoms can be caused by multiple organisms. And also, if you delve into the literature, we'll find that it can also be caused by fungal infections, and it can also even be caused by some environmental triggers. So because of that, we decided that we would publish this, and we are hoping that people will appreciate that the term PAPIS is highly useful. There is no other term in the literature that embraces these kinds of illnesses and is willing to consider them together. For me, the term PAPIS is analogous to the term cancer. While cancer does describe a medical condition or medical conditions, obviously the kind of cancer that you have, the subset of cancer that you have, reflects the outcome and the probability, the prognosis you will have. And so it will be with PAPIS. So if we look for commonality of symptoms and treatment for all the different subsets in the description of PAPIS, the research will be accelerated, the treatment will be accelerated, and hopefully the cures for these syndromes will be accelerated.
We'll be back with more of my conversation with Dr. Friedman and Dr. Maughan after this song by George Mann, One Day You Just Wake Up and You're Old, from the Coronavirus Sessions.
Close your eyes now, Nicky, I've got one more story left. Then I'll sing goodnight, Irene, and put your name in once again. You know your uncle loves you, and he'll be here till the end. But no one knows just how long that might be. Let me tell you something that my uncle said to me. Always stand on principle, and you'll always be free. Choose your best friends wisely, tend those friendships carefully, and then you'll never truly be alone. I'm running out of paper, and I'm running out of time. I long ago ran out of jokes, and I'm running out of rhymes. And I spend too much time searching for a pot of gold. One day you just wake up and you're old. And when your eyes are open, you'll see things you can't ignore. How life rewards the powerful and shuns aside the poor. And once you've had a taste of it, you'll keep on wanting more. And then you find out nothing comes for free. I'm running out of paper, and I'm running out of time. I long ago ran out of jokes, and I'm running out of rhymes. You spend your life in labor trying to build a pot of gold, but one day you just wake up and you're old. So close your eyes now, Nicky, let me take you for a ride. We'll travel past the grief and loss, come through the other side. If I could spare you all this pain, you know that I would try. But George's magic only goes so far. I'm running out of paper, and I'm running out of time. I long ago ran out of jokes, and I'm running out of rhymes. And I put too much faith in people I was counting on. One day you just wake up and they're gone. So don't spend too much time searching for a pot of gold. One day you just wake up and you're old.
That's George Mann, One Day You Just Wake Up and You're Old, from his album, The Coronavirus Sessions. And now let's get back to my conversation with Doctors Friedman and Maughan. So we're talking about human immune response, and we're talking about new syndromes that keep showing up, that either are newly emergent or we just never had names for them. Are we in this biosphere compromised? Is the immune response of humanity in general in some way being attacked or compromised by aspects of the way we live, the way the biosphere is changing? Are there broader immune ramifications to all of this?
Well, our immune system is constantly changing. Our immune system reflects the environment in which we live. Each of us, as members of a community, are subject to a set of unique exposures, and our individual immune systems will reflect those exposures. As David has already mentioned, part of the reaction of our immune system is genetically controlled. So there is a genetic contribution to our immune systems. And in fact, if you read reviews of how our immune systems work, you find out that our immune systems are, quote, hardwired, which would be the genetic contribution. And then there is a more subjective or environmentally influenced part of the immune system. And that is the part that is made up of these cells that respond to different stimuli or to different challenges. So yes, we are being challenged by our environment, and perhaps we are being challenged more due to the way that we live now. Our past exposures shape our immune system function, and to a certain extent, that is what the current COVID vaccines are trying to do. They are influencing our immune system to be resistant to certain parts of the COVID virus so that it will not reproduce in our bodies and cause us harm. Another part of the immune system is the part that is influenced by what is already in our body, and that is our microbiome. Hopefully your listeners are aware of the fact that we all walk around with what I will call a bacterial garden inside of us, inside our digestive systems, that is known as the microbiome. And the microbiome not only influences the immune system, but the immune system also influences the microbiome, so that people who are sick have a microbiome that is different than healthy people, and vice versa. Healthy people have a different microbiome than sick people. But what seems to be happening is that our microbiome, particularly in Western civilizations, where we have high-income countries, where we overuse antibiotics, where we change our diet at will, we are limiting our microbiome or changing them such that we don't have the diversity that we once had in our microbiome. And this will have consequences on our immune system as well. People who are concerned about nutrition, concerned about immune system function, encourage people to eat natural foods and to use antibiotics only when necessary. And so by doing so, we hope to maintain the diversity not only of our digestive system, but also of our immune system.
So it's nature and nurture, very clearly. And the microbiome, like the macrobiome, thrives with biological diversity, just like human cultures thrive with diversity. This is very interesting. I love the macro-micro stuff. Let's talk about long COVID and ME/CFS, a little more about how they function similarly so that we can look at approaches to them. Are things that have helped folks with ME/CFS going to help folks with long COVID?
I believe the answer is yes. I think that we should start at the beginning, namely that there is overlap of symptoms of long COVID and ME/CFS, and yet there are differences as well. The first thing to appreciate is that long COVID and the majority of ME/CFS cases are viral in origin for the most part. They both represent virally induced chronic illnesses. Currently, there are no specific medical treatments for either. What the clinics are doing is trying to treat the symptoms of both. And the symptoms that can be treated are things like the fatigue, the shortness of breath, what's considered brain fog or confusion, mental processes that aren't going as quickly as they once had before. Headaches can be treated, non-restorative sleep can be treated, and joint and muscle pain can be treated. And there are probably other things that I have forgotten to mention. But those are symptoms in common for which ME/CFS patients are treated. And what we are trying to do is to reach out to what I call the pop-up long-haul COVID clinic centers and say, hey, you should be reading the literature that we have produced with regard to the kinds of treatments for these symptoms that have been successful for ME/CFS, because there is a very high probability that these symptom treatment protocols will be successful for these very same symptoms in long-haul COVID patients.
Just a quickie break to remind you you're listening to Paradigms at paradigms.life and my conversation with doctors Ken Friedman and David Maughan, both researchers with plenty to say about the similarities between myalgic encephalomyelitis and chronic fatigue syndrome and long-haul COVID. What are your thoughts about this? We'd love to see your comments. And if you're interested in being notified every time a new episode comes up, click that subscribe button. Let's get back now to the conversation. How many of these symptoms are related to issues of inflammation? How effective can reducing inflammation be in making people feel better?
I think inflammation plays a large part. I don't think there is a body of scientific literature that will indicate that when inflammation is reduced, a specific symptom is also reduced. I don't think the literature has gotten to be that specific or pursued that particular avenue. What has been studied in the past, and to some extent has been demonstrated in the literature for ME/CFS patients, is that for a large number of them, the exacerbation of their symptoms is accompanied by an increase in their viral titers as assessed by the presence of higher concentrations in their bloodstreams. And if antivirals are administered to those patients, the viral titers go down, and so do their symptoms. So in general, there is a correlation between symptoms, viral titers, and inflammation, as we define it as the presence of viral titers. But there hasn't been a study that quantifies the relationships between them.
Ken was actually quite influential in the direction my going into this research of trying to understand the cause and try to develop treatments. He was insightful about directing me, Kathleen, toward an antiviral drug called valganciclovir. It attacks the virus. That was extremely beneficial for Kathleen. He said it worked for his daughter. We got a prescription through a medical specialist, and it worked for Kathleen. So it helped a great deal in damping down this disease. this illness and making her feel better.
So is there any protocol right now using antivirals or antiretrovirals? No one uses that term retrovirus anymore, but it seems like that's what we're dealing with. Is there any protocol or research using those compounds with COVID?
Perhaps in Peterson's group, also Stanford and Harvard are involved in their collaboration. They have a collaborative group.
Yeah, they do, but I'm not sure there's a retro or an antiviral for COVID, is there?
They were mostly all developed for HIV. That was the big breakthrough in
That's correct.
antivirals, right?
Right.
And now, obviously, finding other applications. But
Yeah.
that's interesting. It would be interesting for someone to undertake. Someone must be.
I keep I guess I have to say my eyes close to the literature.
Mm-hmm.
And I have not seen one paper that indicates use of an antiviral to rid humans of COVID.
I agree.
If it is being researched, and I would hope it is being researched, but it has not been published yet.
Yeah.
To my knowledge, no study has been published yet.
I would concur with that too, because I kept an eye on the literature as well as I've gone into my own studies. But one of the problems is that only recently has money started to flow into this problem of antivirals and viruses itself. With the long COVID, there's about 1.2 billion devoted to some extent to research in this area, long COVID. And the ME/CFS part of this, which, as you mentioned, is very similar symptomology to long COVID, they only have had received in the past maybe $5 million from NIH.
That's like lunch money.
That's woefully for such a massive endeavor. It's almost a Manhattan-like project that's required to address this terrible issue of viral infections and bacterial infections, the entire systems diseases that we have in place right now. We need more money.
$5 million is embarrassing. I mean, that's shameful.
Well, at the same time, I could insert that HIV research. At the same time that NIH was giving out $5 million, HIV researchers were, receiving over $1 billion in funding. And it's a far smaller population, far smaller than.
All depends on which disease gets the most PR, right?
Unfortunately, that's how it is. The federal government changed paradigms of how money was to have been awarded. There was a time up to, what would that be, about 1975, when the federal government put money into general basic medical research, but then medical research became politicized. And at that point, it became very competitive, and essentially the money went to the disease or the diseases that essentially were able to exert the greatest political pressure. And to some extent, you can understand that. Hopefully, those diseases that affect the largest portion of the population would make the most noise for funding and therefore receive it, but that is not always the case. And what it does is it puts the money into silos. So much money goes here and so much money goes there. There is little crosstalk between the particular diseases. And so therefore, what is learned for one disease, which may be relevant to other diseases, is not particularly shared. And therefore, it's a very inefficient way of spending money and doing research.
We'll be back with more of this conversation with Drs. David Maughan and Ken Friedman after we hear this song from Hamza from her album First Signs of Me, Breathing.
All my life I've been searching for truth, when all this
this time. It was all in me. I had lost my way. Life had lost its purpose, and all its worth was far from here. And now I'm here to stay. It had almost ended, and I was certain why. All I had to do was try. Now I'm breathing, breathing like I never did. And now I'm breathing. In the sky I have spread my wings. Seas I've sailed and ships I've sunk, just to leave me right back at one. From my troubles, oh yes, I've run up. With this burden now I am done. I had lost my way. Life had lost its purpose, and all its worth was far from here. And now I'm here to stay. It had almost ended, and I was certain why. All I had to do was try. Now I'm breathing, breathing like I never did. And now I'm breathing. In the sky I have spread my wings. Send in my help whenever you need. I'll be there. Now I'm breathing, breathing like I never did. And now I'm breathing. In the sky I have spread my wings.
That's Breathing from the album First Signs of Me by the artist Hamza. Now let's get back to my conversation with doctors Friedman and Maughan. ME, CFS, Lyme disease, these are diseases that were poo-pooed for a long time, that the medical profession didn't take seriously. They said to people, oh, it's all in your head. And it really took a long time, and actually a lot of people suffering and dying before Lyme was even recognized as a thing, and ME, CFS as well. So at least we're making a little progress there, but there is a lot of politics in this, unfortunately.
In terms of the funding, which is critically needed from the government, I think a lot of research now in this area is being supported by donations, different crowdsourcing of the nature. In my case, I've had some generous donors contributing to my research. Since I retired 14 years ago, 12 years ago, I've done all my research pro bono. And so I had to really learn a new field, metabolism. So I've been involved in some metabolic projects now, immunology, because there's an immune component to this disease, and then genetics too. So I have projects, I'm involved in projects with collaborators in all these three areas. And so far, although we haven't published anything yet, the research is on its way, wholly supported by donations.
Part of the big privatization of
It is,
so
yeah.
much.
Well, it's necessary because of the inadequate funding from the government.
I have another question. I asked you about inflammation. The other thing I'm wondering about how much it applies across these various illnesses is oxygenation. We know that one of the issues with COVID is reduced absorption due to lung damage that the virus does. But we also know that increased oxygenation seems to help people when they're ill. Obviously, we need oxygen for our brains to work. I'm curious about increased oxygenation, both as treatment, but also, just like with inflammation, as prevention. If our bodies are in a state of lower inflammation and high oxygenation, are we more likely to handle these pathogens with less damage?
The presenting symptom of fatigue, which is the most frequent symptom in common for both long-haul COVID and ME/CFS, based upon something called meta-analysis, which is a paper that I requested had written, and fortunately some of my colleagues agreed to do it, and we published in one of our themed issues, suggests that oxygenation is a problem. But behind that simple statement, oxygenation is a problem, there are many, many parts of the pathway of oxygen from coming into the body to actually getting it to where it is needed. Obviously, you have to breathe in. It has to get into your lungs. There are small little sacs in your lungs called alveoli, where the oxygen that's brought into your lungs has to get into the bloodstream. Once the oxygen is into the bloodstream, it has to go through smaller and smaller blood vessels into vessels that are very small, which are called capillaries. And the capillaries bring the oxygen to the tissues, and then there needs to be an exchange of the oxygen out of the capillary and into the cells of the particular tissues. So the problem is, where in this exchange process, where in this transport process of oxygen from the outside to the tissues where it is needed, does the hangup in ME/CFS and long-haul COVID occur? Now, I've only taken it as far as getting it to the cells itself, but when the oxygen is in the cells, that oxygen has to eventually end up in a metabolic pathway that ends up in a portion of the cell, actually a compartmentalized part of the cell called the mitochondrion. And the mitochondrion then utilizes the energy from that oxygen to conduct cellular metabolism. And that cellular metabolism is essentially what gives you the energy. It's mitochondrial function that ends up providing the energy of the cell. And if your mitochondria are not working properly, then you will feel fatigue. There will be a backup of waste products. And so there is this long succession of processes that has to happen. And at this point in time, it's not clear where the backup occurs. And it could be one backup, or it could be more than one backup. For some of the long-haul COVID patients who happen to end up with scarring in their lungs, for them it's obvious. The scarring prevents the oxygen from getting into their bloodstream, and they will have low oxygen levels in their bloodstream. But other than those particular patients, it's very difficult to say where along that chain of events that needs to occur to get oxygenation or to continue adequate cellular metabolism, the problems occur.
Here's a little musical palate cleanser for your mind, and then we'll be back with the final part of my conversation with Drs. Friedman and Maughan. That was the Payard Chamber Orchestra, works from Pachelbel. Just a little palate cleanser for your mind. Now here's the final part of my conversation with Dr. Ken Friedman and Dr. David Maughan, talking about similarities between long-haul COVID and myalgic encephalomyelitis and chronic fatigue syndrome.
As Ken mentioned, there are the mitochondria, and that's the focus of my research right now. In fact, I just had an NIH grant that just terminated that studied that very the function of the mitochondria at the level at which the ATP, or the fuel of the body, is generated. Now, every cell in the body has mitochondria, except for red blood cells. But every cell in the body needs mitochondria. If you didn't have the mitochondria and the fuel it provided, you would be dead instantly. In my view, that is the working hypothesis. That's where the core problem lies, because fatigue is really a problem of energy, providing energy and restorative energy. So the mitochondria, I think, are key to that. And what my team that I'm involved with is really focused on is the mitochondria and the cellular components, that is the proteins, that clump into a group called complexes that provide the fuel through a variety of different pathways in the mitochondria, chemical pathways.
So how do we make our mitochondria healthy?
There's a number of ways that are being attacked right now to try to do it. There's powerful antioxidants, for example. My wife is taking one. It's called astaxanthin. It's a natural antioxidant that takes very chemically damaging oxygen that interrupts protein function.
The free radicals.
Free radicals, yeah. I don't want to go into the technical terms, but thank you.
Well, we like the word radical on this show. So
radicals, yeah. Yes. So the radical solution to this is to sop up these free radicals, and that is this astaxanthin, which is one of the very few antioxidants that can actually go through the mitochondrial membrane. So I would recommend that. Okay. She thinks that it does her some good, and I agree. Now, the other thing, the genetic component of this thing, that's more difficult to deal with, because in my wife's case, she's had a transcriptome. There's a genetic analysis of her genome, and the transcripts, I won't go into the details there, but that analysis found that there are variants in these proteins in her mitochondria that are unique to her and to other subjects in the study that she belonged to that are not present in the control group, that is the people without it. So that's the genetic predisposition. If you inherited those variants, then you're more predisposed to ME/CFS and Long Covid in this working hypothesis developing than you would otherwise. So that's going to be a great challenge in the future.
And the mononucleosis just flipped the trigger for her mitochondrial anomalies.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for pointing out, because it's the trigger that's really plus what's called molecular mimicry too. And that's a whole different field of, how the body attacks its own cells and its own proteins. I probably got into far more detail here, Ken, than I should, but I I leave it to you to put it into late terms.
Ken Friedman, David Maughan, doctors, thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing all this important information that, while some of it's fairly technical, I think people can relate to it and understand it and hopefully translate it into informing their own sense of precaution and their own sense of how they take care of themselves should they be sick with one of these things, because there are some real implications. Thank you both so much.
Yep. All right.
Thank you very much.
Doctors Ken Friedman and David Maughan, thank you so much for being on Paradigms and talking with us about the similarities between myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, and long-haul COVID. It looks like, without making any scientific claims whatsoever, the directions to look in are antiviral drugs, high-quality antioxidants, and to make sure that the pathway of oxygenation in our bodies is working well. We want to support mitochondrial health and reduce inflammation in our bodies, and these things will hopefully help if we become ill to make us less ill, and if we are ill to help us recover. This is an area of ongoing study, so we're not claiming anything, just looking into ideas and possibilities and what's worked for other people. Thank you, Doctors Friedman and Maughan. If you enjoyed this episode of Paradigms, I hope you'll check out our archives at the Paradigms website, paradigms.life, and in iTunes and wherever else you find your podcasts. Also, check out our new YouTube channel where we're making videos of the podcasts. I think you'll find them really fun and interesting. Also, please check out our Patreon campaign, patreon.com/paradigms. We really appreciate your support. I'm going to leave you with one more track of music from our dear friends at Opium Moon, their new Grammy-nominated album Night and Day, the song Dream. There's a lot going on in the world, plenty to be distressed about. Let's focus on wellness and well-being for ourselves and those around us and everywhere in the world. We support peace and love and health. Let those be our words for the week. Peace, love, and health. All right, Baruch signing off for Paradigms. We'll see you next time with more inspiring people. Until then, be well. You've been listening to Paradigms at paradigms.life.